Hello, I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is the story of what happened to Medford and Malden. A couple of quick notes before getting into this. While the centers of real-world Medford and Malden are separated by approximately 2 miles, these two cities are combined in Fallout 4. Because of this, I'll be examining them as a single city when speaking about them in the Fallout universe. That being said, we'll start with an examination of the sites surrounding Medford and Malden in the Fallout universe and in the real world. We'll then move to the layout of the town in the Fallout universe and how it compares to the towns in the real world. We'll examine the history of Medford and Malden in the Fallout universe and end with a brief history of Medford and Malden in the real world. Let's get started. In the Fallout universe, Medford and Malden is located at the center of the northern chunk of the Commonwealth that we get to explore in Fallout 4. To the northwest, one can find Dark Hollow Pond, once a small recreational area that is now home to mirelurks and raiders. To the north of town, a supposedly safe nuclear waste storage site at the Mass Fusion Containment Shed is leaking radioactive material into the local environment. Sadly, this unintentional leaking is nothing when compared to the intentional waste dumping that took place here before the bombs. To the east, Greentop Nursery is a site ready to become a settlement should the sole survivor of Vault 111 so desire it. Farther east, Listening Post Bravo once served as a counterintelligence post for the United States military. This post was maintained by a single soldier at any one time, leading to prolonged periods of loneliness and isolation. Sergeant J.P. Ranksey, seemingly one of the last soldiers to hold that post, experienced many strange things as he listened for espionage. These included disturbing statements on the radio, banging on the other side of a door that was inaccessible, and the revelation that he may have hallucinated everything. This site is also important in the story of Brotherhood of Steel Paladin Dance, but that's a story for another time. Southeast of town, Relay Tower 0MC-810 can serve to boost the broadcast strength of local radio signals if activated. South of Medford and Malden, one can find the West Everett Estates, a housing development that was under construction at the time of the bombs. I covered the story of some of those living there in my video covering the Turnquist family. Southwest of town, Taffington Boathouse, a site that served as a frat house before the bombs, recently and briefly became the home to the Sutton family. While in-game Medford and Malden lies on a small waterway that I assume is an analog of the Malden River, about where one can find the real Malden, real-world Medford lies on the Mystic River. Let's now compare the locations of real-world sites that can be found in-game with their in-game locations. The town of Lexington, one of the closest to Medford and Malden in the game, is found to the west-southwest. In the real world, Lexington lies approximately 6.5 miles west of Medford. Saugus Ironworks, found east of Medford and Malden, could be considered an in-game analog of Saugus, Massachusetts, which is found approximately 4 miles northeast of Malden in the real world. Cambridge, found southwest of Medford and Malden in-game, is approximately 3 miles south of Medford in the real world. Charlestown, found south of Medford and Malden in-game, is approximately 3.25 miles south of Malden in the real world. Boston, lying south of Medford and Malden in-game, is about 4.25 miles southeast of Medford and 4 miles south of Malden in the real world. Also of note, the community of Everett, which might be considered to be represented in the West Everett Estates, can be found approximately 1.33 miles southeast of Malden in the real world. With the sites around Medford and Malden covered, let's consider the layout of the town itself. In the real world, Medford is laid out on a loose grid that generally runs either parallel or perpendicular to the Mystic River. Its layout is broken to the north and south by the Mystic River, and to the east and west by Interstate Highway 93, which runs from the south of Boston to St. Johnsbury, Vermont. Malden is also laid out on a loose grid, but in this case it's even more loose than Medford, as there was no Mystic River in the immediate vicinity to guide its development. In the Fallout universe, Medford and Malden primarily circles a loop of road at the center of town. While the town in-game primarily consists of a downtown, in the real world the towns appear fairly suburban, at least when compared to the more rural Lexington and Concord. One feature that the in-game town and real-world Malden share in common, at least to an extent, is the Malden Center Station on the Orange Line of the MBTA. I say to an extent because the real version of the station is above ground, while the in-game station is subterranean. Alright. Comparisons aside, let's get into the composition of Medford and Malden in the Fallout universe as it's represented in Fallout 4. Medford and Malden is host to 9 houses, apartments, shops with apartments, a delicatessen, multiple other restaurants, a dry cleaner, a salon, 2 bookstores, several shops, the corporate headquarters of the donut shop chain Slocum's Joe, the biomedical company MedTech at MedTech Research, Malden Middle School and the underlying Vault-Tec Vault, Vault 75, Medford Memorial Hospital, a theater, a police station, a basketball court, an army office, 2 Pulowski preservation shelters, a parking garage, a bus stop, and the Malden Center Station. The northeast end of town has been fairly well destroyed by the opening of the Old Gullet Sinkhole. This large depression that appears to center around a broken underground pipe has swallowed up a few structures. One of these has become host to a deathclaw. With the composition of the town covered, let's move on to the history of Medford and Malden in the Fallout universe. In the years before the war, Medford and Malden was a fairly well-to-do suburb of Boston, where residents found work in the fields of medicine, business, and research. At Slocum's Joe headquarters, researchers had recently created a new product they called the Buzz Bite, a donut hole that contained liquid coffee in such a way as to keep the coffee hot. Unfortunately for the creators of this new product, the third-degree burns induced by the coffee within were enough to keep the item off the market. At MedTech Research, the researchers were hard at work creating helpful but addictive medications, along with the cures to the addictions created by their medicines. The unethical nature of the cycle they were building in selling both the addiction and the cure pales in comparison to what was occurring in the voluminous basement of the facility. Test subjects, locked in small observation cells, were undergoing rigorous experiments that ended in their dissection and the disposal of their remains in a pair of large dumpsters. The purpose of these experiments was the creation of a medicine called Prevent. Whatever Prevent was intended to prevent or treat is unknown, but sales memos predicted a massive boost to sales in the coming years. As the threat of nuclear war rose in the late 2070s, the parents of Medford and Malden were thrilled to learn that Malden Middle School would host Vault-Tec's Vault 75, and that they would be providing subsidized admission to the children of the town. I cover the full story of Vault 75 in another video, but I think it suffices to say that what the Vault had in store for the children and their parents was not what it seemed. On the morning of Saturday, October 23, 2077, the threat of nuclear war was realized as the United States and the People's Republic of China initiated a global nuclear conflagration. The bombs fell on the west coast first, with waves of fire falling further and further east over the course of minutes. In Medford and Malden, the sirens gave people little more than time enough to panic. Cars clogged the streets, parents rushed their children to the vault. At MedTech, a site-wide lockdown went into effect, sealing all those that remained in the building inside. Some of those without school-aged children were smart enough to know they couldn't outrun the blasts and attempted to take shelter in Malden Center Station. When the bombs began to detonate in the Boston area, the earth began to shake as the force of the global nuclear war released the pent-up forces tied up in the plate boundaries. Subway tunnels collapsed, leaving Malden Center Station disconnected from the rest of the MTA. Waves of radiation, force, and fire swept over the town with every nearby detonation. Vehicles stopped functioning as the electromagnetic pulse overloaded their electronics. North of town, a wicked shipping truck carrying radioactive materials and radiation drugs shut down. As the shaking slowed, fallout began to blow in, bringing dangerously radioactive material down on the landscape. Those not within protective shelters suffered radiation poisoning or even ghoulification. Before they would succumb to either, though, those on the surface fought to survive. Thus, the air was filled with the constant rattling of gunfire. When the radiation finally dropped to non-lethal levels and people began to emerge from their shelters, they entered a very different world. Over the next 2 centuries, the ruins of Medford and Malden would be looted by generations of survivors as the buildings fell apart due to lack of regular maintenance. As super mutants began to spread across the Commonwealth, they created outposts in both Medford Memorial and the West Everett Estates. In recent years, raiders took up residence in both the Slocum's Joe headquarters building and the Malden Central Station, with the raiders of the station headed by Helter Skelter. In 2284, the Brotherhood of Steel in the Capital Wasteland sent a recon team to the Commonwealth in search for technology. Recon Squad Artemis, led by Paladin Brandis, came under attack near Medford and Malden, leading 6 of the knights to scuttle their power armor rather than let it be captured. After another few desperate and futile moves, Paladin Brandis was left alone, and he was forced to take cover in a bunker to the north. By 2287, the nearby Taffington Boathouse was briefly host to Mary Sutton and her children, Russell and Margaret. These 3 Suttons had fled the family's abusive patriarch, Bill Sutton, at the Warwick homestead. When Russell Sutton discovered an old holotape that hinted at a Kim stash in the nearby drainage culvert, he decided to check it out. Sadly, he, his sister, and his mother were all killed shortly thereafter by local blood bugs. At Malden Center Station, the synth manumitting organization known as the Railroad has been operating a way station on their synth escape route. When the Institute caught onto this, they sent a squad of Gen 1 synths to seize the site, leading to the deaths of many of the raiders that lived there. Should the sole survivor of Vault 111 choose to do so, they can assist the Railroad in clearing the site of these attackers. The sole survivor can also help Robert McCready in penetrating the emergency lockdown at MedTech Research. This is done in order to reach a treatment of the proprietary drug Prevent, which McCready believes will save his son. Medford Memorial Hospital, with its high supermutant population, is a heavy traffic site for the sole survivor should they attempt to assist the factions of the Commonwealth in a myriad of missions that require delving into the aging hospital's depths. That just about does it for everything that I found on the in-game history of Medford and Malden. So let's move on to the real-world history of the two. Let me start this by saying that most of the information here comes from the Medford Historical Society, and that this is only a summary of some of what they have to offer, so I recommend you check it out if you're interested in learning more. Now then, I've already covered the geological and Paleo-Indian history of the region in my video on Concord, so if you're interested in the pre-recorded history of the area, that's a good place to start. We're going to begin the story of real-world Medford and Malden in the early 17th century, when the lands that now host the two cities were held by the Native Americans. The natives that lived where Medford now stands were the Namkiag. If you watched my video on Salem, you may remember that modern Salem sits on another piece of land that was once held by the Namkiag. When the English arrived, they found an abandoned village and believed that the natives had permanently left the area. What they didn't know was that the Namkiag were semi-nomadic, moving from site to site depending on the time of year. The Namkiag had forgiven this transgression as a simple misunderstanding. In Medford's case, the land was once the winter home of the Namkiag, as well as being the site for the burial of their sachem Nanapashamet. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, but I could not find the proper pronunciation. Nanapashamet had been killed in a war with the Tarratines in 1619. Tarratine was the Massachusetts name given to a tribe of the Mi'kmaq that raided the region. The Tarratines, who lived farther north along the coast, were in better shape than their neighbors to the south, having weathered European disease outbreaks that tore through the Massachusetts people. Along with this, the Tarratines were better equipped, having access to guns through their trading with trappers in modern Maine. By 1630, English colonists were beginning to settle in the land around Medford. At that time, this was in the outer reaches of Charlestown, the town that sits just across the Charles River from Boston's North Shore. Many of the colonists likely were part of the Winthrop Fleet, a fleet of 16 ships that carried approximately 1,000 settlers and the new colonial governor, John Winthrop, to Salem in the summer of 1630. The first settlers in Medford seem to have originally called the settlement Mystic, based on the native name for the river on which it sat, but in short order this would be renamed to Medford. The exact basis of the name appears muddled, with some believing that it's a portmanteau of meadow by the ford, while it could also be based on the towns of Mayford or Maidford in England. Regardless of the name, in 1633 the Namkiag who owned the land suffered another epidemic of smallpox, which took the lives of the sons of the last sachem, Nanapashamet, leaving the Namkiag in the hands of Nanapashamet's widow, known only as the Squaw Sachem of Mystic. She would go on to sell off the land of the Namkiag over the coming decades, including the land on which Medford sits in 1639 to the Massachusetts General Court. In 1634, Matthew Craddock, the former governor of the colony, had the land north of the river developed into a plantation. In 1637, a toll bridge was built on the site, the first bridge to cross the Mystic River. This bridge would serve the community until 1787 and would be rebuilt 4 times over the centuries to become the modern Craddock Bridge. Brickmaking was Medford's first major industry, and it remained so from approximately 1650 to 1750. The bricks made there were shipped down the river to Boston and out to the other colonies. Alongside the brick, tiles were also manufactured. Besides this, the people of Medford farmed, fished, and built ships. In fact, shipbuilding had begun in 1631, with Medford producing some of the first ocean-going vessels built in the colonies. Matthew Craddock and his heirs controlled much of the land until 1656, when it was subdivided and sold off to several different families. Now in the hands of several families that wanted to make more decisions about local affairs, they began to host their own meetings, along with attending those in Charlestown. In 1674, they elected a board of selectmen. 10 years later, they were granted the right to raise funds locally. and in 1689 they were allowed to choose their own representative to the legislature. The first religious meeting house was established in 1690, the first minister of which was Reverend John Hancock Sr., grandfather of the more famous John Hancock. The first civil meeting house was established in 1696. As for Malden in the 17th century, the natives that held the land were primarily of the Pinnacook tribe. The Puritans purchased their portion of the land in 1629, along with another section of land from the Squaw Sachem of Mystic in 1639. I believe this is the same purchase by the General Court that obtained the land on which Medford sits as well. The Puritans settled on the land in 1640 as another piece of Charlestown. Malden was then incorporated May 2, 1649, named by Joseph Hills for his home in Malden, England. Medford started the 18th century with a population of 230. At this time, not all residents were free, and a census of slaves in 1755 found there were 34 slaves over the age of 16 in Medford. There was a fairly horrible law in 1734 that called for all non-white servants who were away from their masters without leave to be whipped 10 times and then carried back to their masters, who were then required to pay the deliverer. It was in this period at the start of the 18th century that Medford began to manufacture large quantities of rum. While rum had been produced in the colonies since the 17th century, it was mostly made for domestic consumption. This large-scale manufacturing of rum meant that Medford was constantly importing molasses from the West Indies. Sadly, some of this rum was used in the triangle trade to buy slaves from traders in Africa, to be sold in the West Indies for more molasses. Slavery was outlawed in 1787 when a court ruling ended the institution in Massachusetts. Simon Tufts, a Harvard graduate, established the first doctor's office in Medford in 1724. The first school in Medford was established in 1732. The land south of Medford across the Mystic River was transferred from Charlestown to Medford in 1754. Both Medford and Malden were involved in the American Revolutionary Movement. A resolution was passed in Medford in 1765 in opposition to the Stamp Act. A citizen of Medford was wounded in the Boston Massacre. In 1770, the people of Malden boycotted the consumption of British tea, with the people of Medford joining them in 1774. Malden was the first town to petition the colony to secede from the British Empire. On the night of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere passed through Medford on his midnight ride, bringing news of the British plans to seize war materiel from the colonists. 59 militiamen left Medford for Lexington. These militia battled the British Army at Miriam's Corner, and were part of the force that chased the Redcoats back to Charlestown. Along with these 59 patriots, there were 2 loyalists that left for Boston to join the King's men. The people who stayed at home were a part of the war effort as well, giving shelter to the people of Charlestown that lost their homes to British bombardment. While the war front would move out of Massachusetts, the people of Medford were there for many of the major battles. When the end of the war came in October 1781, the men who had gone off to war returned home and re-entered their old lives. By the turn of the 19th century, both Medford and Malden had grown to more than 1,000 residents. Roads were constructed through Medford by private turnpike companies in the first decade of the 1800s, eventually turning them over to the city over the decades as they were paid off. The Middlesex Canal was also constructed at this time, with the goal of linking Boston to the Merrimack River. This canal, which has largely been erased from the map, once connected Charlestown to Lowell in the years before railroads largely replaced canals in the United States. This time was in fact coming to a close in the 1830s when the Boston and Lowell Railroad was constructed. In 1847, Medford was further connected to the rail network when the Boston and Maine Railroad built a spur into town. In Medford, Tufts University was chartered in 1852, named for Charles Tufts, who donated the land on which it was planted. Just as the original plantation of Matthew Craddock was broken up and sold off to create family farmland in 1656, in 1854 that farmland was broken up again and sold off for new commercial and residential buildings. I just want to stop for a moment and note how crazy it is that 168 years ago, this land was broken up after having been subdivided 198 years before that. I know that the old world has a much longer recorded history, but it's still crazy to me as someone who lives in a town that's not even 150 years old to consider the history of towns that are nearly 400 years old. Anyway though, in a link to another city I've covered, Local abolitionist George Luther Steems was one of the secret financial supporters of John Brown, who used that support to raid the Harper's Ferry arsenal with the hopes of starting a slave uprising in Virginia in 1859. The shipbuilders of Medford were some of the most active in Massachusetts, only having their trade fade in the 1860s and 70s as the world moved on from the wooden ships that Medford was so skilled at producing. When the Civil War came, the men of Medford raised the Lawrence Rifles Volunteer Militia to fight for the Union. In 1868, French astronomer and naturalist Leopold Trevot was living in Medford. He was attempting to breed better silkworms when some of the specimens he was experimenting with, a group of gypsy moths, escaped. Though Mr. Trevot attempted to make it clear how important it was to recapture them, they managed to establish a breeding population in the area and have since spread over much of the northeastern United States. Malden was incorporated as a city in 1882, with Medford becoming one just 10 years later in 1892. In 1889, Medford and Malden high schools held their first Thanksgiving Day football game. Their rivalry is one of the oldest in the country. It was thought that it was around this time that the song Jingle Bells was written by James Pierpont after he watched a sleigh race from Medford to Malden. Though this site may have inspired the song, it wasn't copyrighted until he was working as a music director in Savannah, Georgia. In the 1890s, Medford's horse-drawn streetcars were replaced with electrically driven models. The turn of the 20th century brought with it the death of Medford's rum industry. Under fire from the temperance movement, the last distillery closed in 1905. While both communities grew throughout the 19th century, from the 1880s on, both Medford and Malden grew rapidly, a trend that continued until the 1930 census. Medford grew from an 1870 population of 5,717 to a 1930 population of 59,714. Malden grew from an 1870 population of 7,367 to a 1930 population of 58,036. Medford's population then grew to a peak of 66,113 in time for the 1950 census, before dropping every census up until 2000, when it reached a low of 55,765, growing again through the 2010s to reach 59,659 in the modern day. On the other hand, Malden suffered a similar mid-century slump before starting to grow from the 1980s on, reaching its modern-day high of 66,263. In 2004, a Malden same-sex couple was the first in Massachusetts to legally wed, the ceremony taking place in the Cambridge City Hall. Today, Medford and Malden are a pair of bustling suburbs of Boston. Alright, that just about does it for the history of Medford and Malden, but I have a few things to say about this content before closing it out. First, in the course of researching for this video, I discovered that the color of the tile of the MTA stations in Fallout 4 matches the color of the lines those stations belong to in the real world. For example, Revere Beach on the blue line, Park Station on the green line, and of course Malden Center on the orange line. I thought this was interesting and I figured I'd share it with you. Second, the Buzz Bites that the Slocum's Joe researchers made are a crazy product. To refresh you in case you forgot, these donut holes are said to be made with hot coffee in them that stays hot until consumed. It is even said in the note that the coffee was too hot, causing third-degree burns to those that consumed them. Should you consume them in Fallout 4, they hurt you, cutting your health by 10. This implies to me that 210 years after the war, not only are these donut holes still intact, but they somehow still contain scalding hot coffee. This would be absolutely crazy technology if it were possible. Imagine the applications of a container that was capable of maintaining the temperature of whatever it contained indefinitely. Thermos companies, among others, would be all over that. That focus doesn't even begin to cover the fact that they were edible containers capable of maintaining temperature for 210 years. Even compared to the robots, the fusion reactors, the laser weapons, these Buzz Bites may well be the most impressive piece of technology in the Fallout universe. In fact, they're probably only second to the Gek in terms of miracle technologies of the Fallout universe. Third, the soldier at Listening Post Bravo, Sergeant J.P. Ranksy, is a reference to Jonas Petter Ranksy, singer for the Swedish heavy metal band Catatonia. And I apologize if I mispronounced anything there. There are two T's in what I would otherwise pronounce as Peter. Along with this, the terminal entry that says the sergeant heard DEK on the transmissions is a reference to Catatonia's 2012 album Dead End Kings. Fourth, while researching this, I've come to wonder if Prevent could be another case of medtech selling the cure to the problem they created. I've heard speculation that Prevent was intended to cure the new plague, but nowhere in the game is that listed as the reason for its creation. Those that make this claim generally believe that Robert Macready's son was sick with a new plague. There's no evidence of this as best I can tell, and not only that, but we don't know if Prevent worked on Duncan Macready. We don't have proof that MedTech created the problem Prevent was intended to cure, nor do we even have the name of the disease it was intended to prevent or cure, but I can't help but notice that in the same document where they're predicting a dramatic upswing in the sales of Prevent, they're also noting an increase in the sales of Fixer in the places where they're selling large amounts of Mentats. Just something to consider. Fifth, I'm fairly sure that there are two obvious things that came out in my coverage of Medford and Malden. First, that I had almost no information on Malden, and second, that I had almost no information on the years after the 19th century. I had a lot on Medford because Medford's Historical Society provided a good amount of information about the history of their town, while the only source I had for Malden was the city government site. Along with this, neither source talked much about the 20th century. Alright, I think that'll do it for the story of Medford and Malden. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. I've started streaming on Twitch. I'm currently streaming Thursday evenings and Saturday afternoons, so if you're interested, come by and check it out. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, and Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.